Chapter 3. Land of the Setting Sun. In the early hours of 1 November 1954, a day when French colons were due to celebrate the Festival of All Saints, bands of nationalist guerrillas launched a series of coordinated attacks, 70 in all, across a wide area of Algeria. Their targets included police posts, barracks, bridges, farm buildings, and telephone lines. Leaflets scattered on the streets announced that a new nationalist movement called the Front de Libération Nationale, FLN, had embarked on a revolutionary struggle for independence and would fight on until it had won. The attacks caught the French administration by surprise. Algeria enjoyed a reputation for being a relatively tranquil part of France's empire in the Maghreb, the Arabic name for northwest Africa, meaning land of the setting sun. Algeria was also unique in that its three northern departments, Algiers, Constantine, and Oran, where most of the European population lived, were considered to be a part of France itself, having the same status as departments in mainland France as, say, Seine-et-Oise or Alpes-Maritimes. There was an unmistakable French character to the towns of Algeria. Algiers, the capital, cradled in steep hills dotted with red-tiled villas overlooking one of the most spectacular bays in the Mediterranean, seemed just like a Riviera resort. Its broad boulevards and avenues were lined with expensive shops, kiosks, trottoir cafes, and bookshops. Along the waterfront stood grand, arcaded buildings housing banks and mercantile companies. 1/3 of the population in Algiers was white. In the hinterland lay vast vineyards and cereal and citrus farms owned mainly by colons. The tranquility, however, was deceptive. After 124 years of la présence française in Algeria, French colons, or pieds noirs as they were called, had achieved a total grip on political power, commerce, agriculture, and employment, effectively relegating the majority Muslim population, Arab and Kabyle, to a subservient status and stubbornly resisting all attempts at change. Both groups sent deputies to the National Assembly in Paris, but Muslims numbering 8 million were allocated no more than 15 seats, the same as for the 1 million pieds noirs. Moreover, the pieds noirs could always rely on support from other political parties in the National Assembly, as well as powerful French groups in commerce, banking, and the press to protect their interests. In the turbulent post-war era, as a succession of French governments struggled to survive amid strikes, inflation, austerity, and a debilitating war in Indochina, none was willing to risk antagonizing the pieds noirs population and their supporters for the sake of reform in Algeria. Moderate Algerian nationalists seeking reform were consequently given short shrift. In Algeria itself, the local assembly was effectively subject to the control of the French administration. Elections were blatantly rigged to ensure that amenable Muslim candidates, béni oui oui, as government collaborators were known derisively, won their seats. The upper echelons of the administration were virtually an exclusive French preserve. Of 864 higher administrative posts, no more than 8 were held by Muslims. In rural areas, a thin layer of 250 French administrators ruled over 4 million Muslims. The gulf between the two communities was huge. The vast majority of indigenes were illiterate, poor, and unemployed. In general, they were seen as inferior race, treated with disdain, indifference, or outright abuse. Their numbers were fast growing. In 50 years, the Algerian population had nearly doubled, prompting fears among pieds noirs that they were in danger of being swamped. In urban areas, most lived in wretched bidonvilles, tin can slums on the outskirts of towns. Algiers in 1954 harbored 140 bidonvilles built on wasteland and demolition sites and in the ravines that ran down to the sea. In the Kasbah, the old fortress palace of Algiers, some 80,000 Muslims were packed into an area of 1 square kilometer, an Arab town embedded in a European city. There were limited job prospects for Muslims. Preference was usually given to Petit Blancs. Nearly 2/3 of the rural population was officially classified as destitute. Unable to find employment in Algeria, 500,000 indigenes worked in France, mainly as unskilled laborers. The plight of Algerians and their frustration at being blocked at every turn were fertile ground for militant nationalists. In 1947, they formed a revolutionary group, Organisation Spéciale, a prototype of the FLN, dedicated to armed struggle. Among the founder members was Ahmed Ben Bella, a 29-year-old former warrant officer in the French army, who had been awarded both the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille Militaire for bravery in the Second World War. In 1949, in the first important action undertaken by the group, Ben Bella organized a raid on the main post office in Oran, which netted 3 million francs. With poor security, the Organisation Spéciale was soon broken up by French intelligence. Ben Bella himself was arrested and sentenced to 8 years' imprisonment. In 1952, however, he managed to escape from prison by sawing through the bars of his cell with a blade hidden in a loaf of bread and made his way to Cairo, establishing a base there under Nasser's auspices.
In the spring of 1954, the militants regrouped. A committee of 9 leaders, subsequently known as the Chefs Historiques, was formed to organize armed rebellion. 6 were based in Algeria. 3, including Ben Bella, were exiles living in Cairo, where they looked to Nasser to provide them with arms. Under the noses of French intelligence, they proceeded to draw in recruits and to collect weapons. To their intense disappointment, Nasser, despite all the rhetoric about Arab liberation poured out by Cairo radio, failed to deliver any material support until the war was well underway. To launch their rebellion, they possessed no more than about 400 miscellaneous weapons, most of them sporting guns. A network of bomb factories set up in the labyrinth of alleys in the Kasbah produced only primitive devices. The targets were carefully chosen: government installations, French military personnel and gendarmes, private property of Grand Colons, and Muslim collaborators. Strict instructions were issued to avoid white civilian casualties. But despite all the preparations, many of the attacks launched on All Saints' Day failed. None of the main targets in Algiers, the radio station, the telephone exchange, the gasworks, a petroleum depot, and a French-owned warehouse, was seriously damaged. When police, army, and intelligence chiefs met at an emergency conference in Algiers on the morning of 1st November, all were agreed that the government was facing isolated incidents rather than a general insurrection. They nevertheless ordered severe reprisals. Police made indiscriminate mass arrests, incarcerating hundreds of Muslims, including moderate nationalists uninvolved with the rebellion. As paratroop reinforcements arrived from France, punitive expeditions were launched in the RS Mountains, a traditional bandit stronghold which the FLN had made the main focus of its guerrilla operations. Security forces repeatedly conducted ratissages against Algerian communities, brutally raking them over for signs of guerrilla support. In Algiers, the FLN network was crushed within 2 weeks. Only in the RS did the French face a significant military problem. But as winter set in, The FLN contingent there was reduced to no more than 350 active maquisards. After the initial shock of the All Saints' Day attacks, life for the Pieds Noirs resumed much as before. No one seriously thought that France had entered a new war. In Paris, the government remained adamant. The Algerian departments are part of the French Republic, declared the Prime Minister, Pierre Mendès France, in November 1954. They have been French for a long time, and they are irrevocably French. Having survived the harsh winter months, the FLN renewed its offensive in the spring of 1955, concentrating on soft targets. Hundreds of Muslim officials were tortured, mutilated, and murdered. The French poured in reinforcements, expanding their forces to 100,000 men, double the number stationed in Algeria at the start of the rebellion. Their ratissages became ever more brutal. Collective punishment was enforced against villagers. Thousands were sent to internment camps. Both sides resorted increasingly to the use of terror tactics. In August 1955, the war exploded in full horror. Abandoning their policy of avoiding white civilians in the conflict, the FLN now made them a direct target. To colonization's policy of collective repression, we must reply with collective reprisals against the Europeans, military and civil, who are all united behind the crimes committed, declared Youssef Zagout, a guerrilla leader in the Constantine area. For them, no pity, no quarter. In the harbor city of Philippeville, an FLN mob swarmed into the streets, hurling grenades into cafes, dragging white motorists from their cars and slashing them to death. In a small mining center in the Philippeville district, FLN groups went from house to house, slaughtering all the occupants, including women and children. In all, 71 whites died. French forces took savage reprisals, shooting Muslims at random. Pieds Noirs formed vigilante groups, executing Muslims summarily. According to official French figures, 1,273 insurgents died. The FLN, giving names and addresses, claimed the figure was as high as 12,000. In this ferocious struggle, there was no longer hope of compromise. The middle ground fell apart. Moderate nationalists who had striven for years to achieve concessions from the French threw in their lot with the FLN. Among them was Ferhat Abbas, a leading liberal, former deputy to the National Assembly, a middle-class évalué married to a Frenchwoman, for whom the idea of negotiation had once been all-important. When the insurrection had begun, he had denounced it. "We continue to be persuaded that violence will settle nothing," he had said. Now he declared his support for the FLN. "They know in Paris that I am honest, that I work only for a return to peace. Today, I can do nothing inside my own country or in France. I have knocked on all the doors. I have spoken to all the politicians able to understand me, to understand us. Those who have really understood can do nothing. I cannot continue any longer to stand bail for a situation of which I entirely disapprove. My departure will show at last to my fellow citizens that I have withdrawn from ineffectual politics. I am simply joining the organization that struggles for the liberation of Algeria, because there is no other way."
Thus, Algeria descended into an inferno of violence, an endless cycle of repression and revenge that was eventually to destroy the Fourth Republic. France's determination to hold on to Algeria meant reappraising its involvement in the rest of the Maghreb, in Morocco and Tunisia, where French rule was also under challenge from nationalist movements, but where French interests were less deep-rooted. Both Morocco and Tunisia were governed as protectorates under international treaties which obliged France to act in the name of their indigenous rulers, the Sultan of Morocco and the Bey in Tunisia. Although both territories possessed large European communities, as vociferous and demanding as Algeria's whites, they had never been allowed to acquire political rights. The struggle in both territories revolved around settler demands for representation and nationalist demands for independence. France had ruled Morocco since 1912, when the Sultan surrendered control of external affairs, but not internal sovereignty. Instead of a governor-general, France was represented by a resident general technically attached to the Sultan's court. In practice, the French administration controlled every aspect of government, as the number of colons increased over the years, eventually reaching 400,000. They persistently pressed for a share in power, in effect for co-sovereignty. They were supported by powerful lobbies in Paris and retained a virtual stranglehold over the administration in Morocco, enabling them to exert strong pressure on the resident general. The reigning sultan, Mohammed ben Yusuf, however, was not amenable. Educated by French tutors, he had reached the throne in 1927 at the age of 17, the 18th member of the Alawid dynasty in northwest Africa to become monarch, mainly because the French considered he would be politically malleable. But though avaricious and extravagant, he had nevertheless turned out to be hard-working, profoundly attached to Islam and inclined to support nationalist demands for independence. In a dramatic speech in 1947, he proclaimed Morocco's affiliation to the Arab world and demanded recognition of Morocco's national aspirations, drawing him into open conflict with France. He then further infuriated the colonial power by withholding his signature to French decrees, thereby causing administrative deadlock. The French retaliated by encouraging the Sultan's rivals, Berber chieftains, to organize a vast march demanding that he be deposed. Using this as a pretext, the French government on 20 August 1953 duly deposed him, sending him into exile with his youngest wife and concubines, first to Corsica, then to Madagascar, and replacing him with an elderly uncle, a wealthy landowner who had previously played no role in political life. The exiled sultan, however, swiftly became the focus of nationalist agitation, uniting the urban and rural populations, the middle class and the peasantry, behind a common cause. Violence and disorder afflicted towns and the countryside, culminating in the formation of a liberation army. In Tunisia, which France had occupied since 1881, the French faced similar nationalist ferment. Frustrated by the resistance of the white community of 250,000 to any political reform, nationalists organized violence across the country. In this struggle, the Bey of Tunis played no role, an eccentric figure who filled his palace with clocks and kept a private troupe of dwarfs. He spent much of his time indulging his passion for astronomy and alchemy, mixing secret brews and potions in his laboratory. The impetus for change came instead from an articulate middle class. Their leader, Habib Bourguiba, an energetic lawyer born in 1903, trained in Paris and married to a Frenchwoman, had been in and out of prison for much of his career. Shortly after founding the Neo-Destour Party in 1934, he had been exiled to the Sahara for 20 months. Upon his release, he had traveled to Paris pressing his demand for the replacement of the despotic regime by a constitutional regime which permits the people to participate in power. Arrested again in 1938, he spent the next 4 years in prisons in Tunisia and France. In 1945, as France resumed its grip over Tunisia, Bourguiba fled in a smuggler's boat, making his way to Cairo, endeavoring to raise help from the Arab world but finding little support there. Returning to Tunisia in 1949, he cajoled the French into implementing reform. A new French administration in Paris agreed in 1950 to measures moving Tunisia towards internal autonomy, but the reforms were thwarted largely by pressure from colons. Bourguiba planned to take the issue to the United Nations, but was arrested, taken first to a prison in the Sahara, then transferred to La Galite, an island in the Mediterranean 40 miles north of Bizerte, uninhabited except for a few lobster fishermen. After 2 years, he was taken to another island, Grua, off the coast of Brittany, and interned there until a new French administration decided to move him to Chantilly, near Paris. In the meantime, political violence in Tunisia steadily mounted. Rather than face a contagion of wars in North Africa, the French government decided to adjust its priorities. Morocco and Tunisia were ultimately dispensable. Algeria, the center of French interests and investment, considered as much a part of France as the mainland itself, would be held at all costs. In June 1955, Bourguiba returned to Tunis in triumph, welcomed by cheering crowds lining the quayside and the avenues leading to the Bey's palace. 2 days later, an agreement granting internal autonomy to Tunisia was finally signed. In November 1955, Ben Yusuf returned from exile to the throne in Morocco amid popular acclaim, duly recognized by the French government as His Majesty Mohammed V. In March 1956, Both Morocco and Tunisia were granted independence. For Algeria, 6 more years of terrible civil war lay ahead. Under pressure from pieds noirs ultras demonstrating on the street of Algiers, the French Prime Minister, Guy Mollet, agreed in 1956 to increase French forces in Algeria to 500,000 men in a bid to crush the rebellion. To find the extra manpower, he had to extend military service for conscripts to 30 months and call up reservists. At the same time, the government acquired special powers, enabling it to suspend individual rights in its pursuit of military victory. In effect, France was committing itself to total war. The military grew ever more powerful. In a spectacular escapade in October 1956, they succeeded in hijacking a plane carrying Ben Bella on a flight from Morocco to Tunisia. Ben Bella had been visiting Morocco to take possession of a shipment of arms for the FLN. He had been due to leave for Tunis on a personal plane provided by Mohammed V to attend a meeting to discuss a possible truce, an initiative encouraged by Mollet and supported by Morocco and Tunisia. But at the last minute, told that there was insufficient room on the King's plane, he had taken off in an Air Maroc aircraft with a French crew. Tipped off that Ben Bella was no longer flying under the protection of the King, French generals in Algiers decided to force down the Air Maroc plane on Algerian soil. Ben Bella subsequently spent 5 years without trial in French prisons. The hijacking of Ben Bella, in flagrant breach of international law, was greeted with jubilation by the pieds noirs population, but caused an international furore. It infuriated Bourguiba and Mohammed V, cut short their willingness to mediate, and made them all the more determined to support the FLN. It also removed from the scene a possible interlocutor, an Algerian leader ready to contemplate negotiation. Fearful of the reaction of the military and the pieds noirs, Mollet possessed neither the will nor the power to release him. In 1957, the focus of the war moved from rural areas to the city of Algiers. After an upsurge of assassinations and bombings of bars and cafes by the FLN and a violent backlash against the Muslim population by pieds noirs mobs, the Governor-General, Robert Lacoste, handed over responsibility for order in the city to the military. It was a fateful decision, effectively relinquishing civilian control of Algeria. Under the command of General Jacques Massou, a veteran combat officer, 4 paratroop regiments moved into Algiers, sealing off the Kasbah, carrying out house-to-house searches, arresting thousands of suspects and taking them to detention centers for interrogation. In scenes reminiscent of French experience under Nazi occupation, the city was divided into sectors, subsectors, blocks, and buildings, each bearing a number or letter, and kept under constant surveillance by warders and informers. Muslim districts were isolated behind barbed wire and subjected to searchlights. When the FLN launched a general strike, it was brutally broken up. At their interrogation centers, the military readily resorted to torture. A favorite method was the jejene, a term used for the generators which delivered electric shocks. Other methods included water torture and mock drownings. In a letter of resignation, Paul Teitgen, Secretary General of the Algiers Police, a former resistance hero who had himself been tortured on 9 occasions by the Nazis during the Second World War, wrote, "In visiting the detention centers, I recognized on certain detainees the deep marks of cruelties and tortures that I personally suffered 14 years ago in the Gestapo cellars." He estimated the number of victims who had disappeared during military interrogation at 3,000. Despite censorship and a shroud of secrecy surrounding what was described as a peacekeeping operation in Algeria. The steady stream of disclosures about the use of torture caused growing public disquiet in France and raised doubts about the whole purpose of France's mission there. A distinguished colonial expert, Robert de la Vignette, wrote prophetically at the end of 1957, "The most serious problem is not the atrocities themselves, but that as a result of them, the state is engaged in a process of self-destruction." What we are witnessing in Algeria is nothing short of the disintegration of the state. It is a gangrene that threatens France itself. Nevertheless, General Massou's paratroops and intelligence units were effective in destroying the FLN's network of bomb factories, arms caches, and combatant groups. The number of attacks fell from 112 in January to 29 in March. Surviving members of the FLN command in Algiers were forced to flee the country and seek sanctuary in Tunisia. In June, there was a brief resurgence of attacks, including the bombing of a dance hall of a casino crowded with pieds noirs. But at the autumn, the last of the bombers had been tracked down. The Battle of Algiers, as it was called, had ended in French victory. Life for the pieds noirs swiftly returned to normal. By early 1958, the French command judged that the war was virtually won. Terrorist attacks in the cities had been defeated. In rural areas, pacification programs were well underway. A network of resettlement camps for 1 million peasants was being built to deprive the FLN of rural support. The army was also successful in recruiting thousands of Algerian auxiliaries, harkis, to help the French war effort. To prevent FLN infiltration from bases in Tunisia and Morocco, the military constructed a system of barrages, electrified wire fences, minefields, and radar alarms running the length of Algeria's frontiers, with formidable effect.
Moreover, the French had a powerful new motive to hold on to Algeria: oil. After 10 years of prospecting, oil had been discovered at Hassi Messaoud, deep in the sands of the Sahara, shortly after the beginning of the war. In January 1958, the first oil started to flow to France. The FLN command, meanwhile, was in serious disarray. Forced out of Algeria, it regrouped in Tunisia. Its policy of urban warfare had proved disastrous, and in rural areas, it was no match for the French military. It was beset by leadership feuds, low morale, and an internecine struggle with a rival nationalist group, the Mouvement National Algérien. Its survival now was largely dependent on the support and protection given by Tunisia. But even though Bourguiba was willing to provide a headquarters base, a route for arms supplies, sanctuary for the FLN army, and training facilities, FLN guerrillas faced severe difficulty trying to penetrate the barrages. In the first 7 months after the barrages were completed in 1957, the FLN estimated its losses there as 6,000 men. While the military managed to gain the ascendancy in Algeria, however, metropolitan France was besieged by crisis. Buffeted by strikes, economic turmoil, and international criticism of the Algerian conflict, successive French governments struggled in vain to shore up the Fourth Republic. In May 1957, after the fall of Guy Mollaire's administration, France was left without a government for 22 days. In October and November, there was no government for 35 days. The next administration collapsed in April 1958, leaving France once more without a government. The vacuum of leadership, the climate of impotence, the plunge of France's prestige around the world all caused mounting disgust at the antics of its politicians. Nowhere was this felt more strongly than among the military. Haunted by memories of their defeat by communists in Indochina and the catastrophe of Dien Bien Phu, resentful of the humiliating retreat from Suez forced upon them by world opinion,
The military were determined not to let victory in Algeria slip from their grasp as the result of a betrayal by weak-willed politicians in Paris. They saw the nationalist struggle in Algeria as evidence of the steady encroachment of communism and believed the battle to keep Algeria French was an essential part of the wider struggle to defend Western values. Their mission, therefore, was not only to restore the grandeur of France, but to halt the decadence of the West. They were convinced they could finish the job in Algeria by striking directly at FLN targets in Tunisia and Morocco, and were held back only by politicians fearful about the international repercussions. What further infuriated the military were signs that some prominent politicians in Paris were prepared to forsake the cause of Algérie Française. During the desperate efforts in April and May to find a prime minister for a new administration, the leading candidate, Pierre Plimflin, announced his intention to open negotiations with the FLN once he was appointed, prompting the commander-in-chief in Algeria, General Raoul Salan, to make an official protest. The army in Algeria, said Salan, would accept nothing less than the total defeat of the rebels. In a telegram to the chief of the general staff in Paris on 9 May, he warned of army intervention in national politics. The army in Algeria is troubled by recognition of its responsibility towards the men who are fighting and risking a useless sacrifice if the representatives of the nation are not determined to maintain Algérie Française. Later that day came an event which detonated this explosive mixture of anger, resentment, and suspicion and propelled French Algeria into rebellion. In Tunis, the FLN announced that, as a reprisal for the execution of FLN fighters by the French, it had executed 3 French soldiers, young conscripts captured 4 months before. A wave of outrage swept through the army and the pieds noirs population. Salan announced that an official ceremony would be held to pay tribute to the 3 dead soldiers on 13 May. Pieds noirs groups prepared for mass demonstrations on the same day. In 10 May, the Governor-General, Robert Lacoste, departed for consultations in Paris, sensing he would never return. Algiers was left without a Governor-General. Paris still had no government. On 13 May, shortly after Salan had laid a wreath at the Monument aux Morts, a pieds noirs mob, led by students, stormed the offices of the Government General, seizing control and demanding the army take power. Appearing on the balcony, Salan and Massu, the hero of the Battle of Algiers, agreed to form a committee of public safety in conjunction with pieds noirs representatives. I could not act otherwise, Massu told Lacoste in a phone call to Paris. Or we would have had to fire on the mob. Galvanized into action by the rioting, the French Parliament finally voted Plimflin into office in the early hours of 14 May. The following day, Plimflin imposed a blockade of Algeria, severing communications links.
In Algiers, the new Committee of Public Safety, now ensconced in the Gouvernement Général building, demanded the return to power of General Charles de Gaulle, the legendary wartime leader of the Free French. The military joined in. Addressing crowds gathered at the Gouvernement Général on 15 May, Salan spoke of his attachment to the soil of Algeria. "What has been done here will show the world that Algeria wants to remain French," he declared. He concluded with a rallying cry of "Vive la France! Vive l'Algérie française!" pausing to add, "Et vive de Gaulle!" For the past 12 years, since abruptly abandoning the presidency, de Gaulle had led a reclusive life in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, southeast of Paris, content with writing his memoirs. At the age of 67, aloof and enigmatic, though convinced of his ability to save France from turmoil and restore its grandeur, he had not expected to hear the call for his return. His supporters, however, both in metropolitan France and in Algeria, had been working assiduously for just such a moment. Responding to the growing clamor, de Gaulle broke his silence. "In the face of the ordeals once more mounting in the country," he declared on 15 May,
He stood ready to assume the powers of the Republic. On 1st June, after 2 weeks of coup plots and tense negotiations, de Gaulle was invested as Prime Minister by the National Assembly with full powers to roll by decree for 6 months and a mandate to draw up a new constitution for France. His return to power was greeted with jubilation by the army and the pieds noirs population in Algeria, all convinced that he would stand unwaveringly behind the cause of Algérie française. Arriving in Algeria on 4th June, de Gaulle was fervently acclaimed a savior. On the balcony of the Gouvernement Général, Salon introduced him to the crowd, declaring, "Our great cry of joy and hope has been heard." The crowd erupted in celebration. Stretching his arms in a V sign above his head, de Gaulle responded, "Je vous ai compris," meaning, "I have understood you."